So, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you are not tired yet. So, thank you for inviting me to moderate this session. Thank you, Carlos. As you know, the theme of this panel is on ethics and responsibility in AI, meaning that we all, academics, researchers, professionals, and students, should be committed to using AI for social good. I propose that each of us takes up to 10-13 minutes for expressing our opinions in the beginning, and leaving between 15 and 20 minutes for interaction, including among ourselves and with the students and the audience, of course. I must start by briefly introduce the outstanding members of this panel. First, Inês de Matos Pinto is Legal and Digital Affairs Advisor to the S&D Group at the European Parliament. Inês Pinto got her bachelor's degree in law at the Nova School of Law in Lisbon and the Master of Law degrees in European Union Law at Leiden University. She has recently published on the draft of the AI Act regarding regulation of ethical aspects of AI, and so, although not coming from a technological field, perfectly fits in this panel team. Inês Sousa is Head of Intelligent Systems Group at Fraunhofer, Portugal. Her group is mainly devoted to data science and machine learning. She got a PhD in biomedical engineering at Instituto Superior Técnico, with a thesis related with fMRI, magnetic resonance imaging. And before that, she was at FEUP Research in Eindhoven for an internship. And she was also visiting researcher at Centre d'Imagerie Biomédicale at École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne. She has been in close contact with industry, and for more than 5 years, she worked at Siemens Healthcare near Porto. She is interested in AI, signal and image processing, and cognitive computing. Thank you also for your participation. Peter van der Putten. Yeah. He has a solid background in AI, and is interested on how intelligence can evolve through learning, in man or machines. Very deep goal. Peter has a Master of Science in Cognitive Artificial Intelligence from Utrecht University and a PhD in data mining from Leiden University, and combines academic research with applying these technologies in business. For more than 15 years, he was guest researcher at Leiden Institute of Advanced Computer Science. He is interested in how AI and data mining can be used to innovate business, science, or art. Peter is director at Pegasystems AI Lab, helping clients to get closer to customers and work smarter with trustworthy AI. Fantastic. It's an honor for us to have you with us, okay? Thank you for coming. Finally, my name is Eugénio Oliveira. I'm Professor Emeritus at the University of Porto, meaning I'm very old already. And I was for the last 4 decades, I was full professor at this university, at this school here, where I did some research and development in AI-based systems, including topics like knowledge-based systems, multi-agent systems, natural language programming, affective computing, etc. Now, coming back to the panel theme on ethics and responsible AI, this is, of course, an endless topic of discussion and has too many different aspects. However, whatever we have to say now, including blaming and criticizing, this is only possible due to the huge amount of research work that has been done for many decades that led to incredible and useful, really useful outcomes in many domains, like healthcare, natural language processing, cyber-physical intelligence systems, autonomous driving, management, robotics, and human-machine interfaces, etc., etc. So I just gave a suggestion to the panel to elaborate on two main issues. You can read them there. The first issue is about the lack of explicability of AI algorithms. So you can read there. In your opinion, would it be desirable to progress towards explainable AI, machine learning, and data science algorithms? If yes, how do you envisage this possibility? Using, for instance, causal logics, precision-like metrics that are already in place. And what about data integrity? We heard about that today already. In fact, the first main driving force of AI, at least in Europe, the first one in the beginning, although not unique, was how to make computers reasoning like humans, meaning mostly logically. This is no longer the case nowadays. Despite recent efforts on understanding artificial neural networks' way of working to produce results, we are still facing tools as a kind of black boxes, most of the time. And I belong to those who believe that more accountability, responsibility, and transparency, the acronym for this is ART, A-R-T, more art in artificial intelligence, would make AI-based systems much more acceptable. So the second issue is having in mind the relevance of AI, machine learning, and data science for social good, what kind of ethics would you propose for AI? Is that necessary? Human-like ethics? How many are there? Special ethics for intelligent machines? Is that possible? I'm not thinking just on the uncertain future where artificial general intelligence and artificial consciousness may become a possibility, some kind of either utopia or dystopia. But I'm mainly thinking in today's risks, including lack of privacy, sociometrics misuse, abusive facial recognition, or the use of so-called laws. You know, laws doesn't mean law. Right? Lethal autonomous weapon systems by the military. Well, each one of us have somewhat different backgrounds and will give their own perspective on this issue. But I firmly believe that AI researchers will be able to develop pieces of software that will be embedded into AI-based systems, will embed there a few apparently simple constraints and kind of human rights principles. But I know that reality is very complex, of course. Reality is different is difficult to interpret. There will be always conflicts in interpretations. This makes it very hard for AI systems to autonomously make the right decisions. However, researchers in AI are already making their way in this decision in this direction, including in the hardware some kind of constraints and principles that make the software and hardware safer. Also, the problem is the human in the loop. The human in the loop might be mandatory in some cases, or not, depending on our faith in humans. Once I was saying that human in the loop is a good thing, and someone says, "Do you believe Trump?" I don't know. Okay, I don't know. So that is it for now. Let's start with Inês Pinto.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, thank you again to Professor Carlos Soares and João Moreira for the invitation to be here today. As already hinted by Professor Eugénio, I will approach this topic from a very different point of view. I am a jurist by education, and that became painfully obvious as I was trying to follow in more detail some of the presentations that we've had before the coffee break. This topic is absolutely fascinating, and there's so much to talk about. So I think for today I will try to structure my intervention or contribution by answering the questions posed by Professor Eugénio on the screen, and also by sharing a little bit of my experience in terms of my involvement with what is currently going on in the European Union, specifically the legislation on AI and how to regulate AI systems. Well, first of all, in your opinion, would it be desirable to progress towards explainable AI? My personal answer, because of course I'm not speaking on behalf of the European Parliament or the Socialists and Democrats group, is a big fat yes. And I am supported by the European Court of Justice. I don't know how many of you might have come across this news article, but around a month ago, there was a judgment by the European Court of Justice about the PNR directive, the Passenger Name Record Directive, which essentially allows law enforcement authorities in the European Union to retain, for the purposes of law enforcement and security for a specific period of time, in line with the GDPR, names and records of European citizens. And throughout the judgment, where many other relevant conclusions are given, the court essentially legislates through jurisprudence on a ban of black box machine learning algorithms when it comes to risk value of passengers. So I think this is a first important indication of where we're headed. And then if I can zoom in on what we are currently discussing at the EU level. So I hope most of you are familiar with the European Commission's proposal on a regulation for artificial intelligence systems in the European Union. The process is a long and complex one, as it should be, because this is not an easy issue to regulate. And this is why I think, once again, the topic of ethics and AI is one where we really need a very strong synergy between policymakers, academics, industry, and all kinds of experts. Nevertheless, there are different actors involved, most notably the Council of the European Union and the European Parliament. And within the European Parliament, the Commission that I follow and where I do most of my work, which is the Committee on Legal Affairs, is exclusively competent for some of the issues that are linked to some of today's presentations. Notably the question of transparency, explainability, and human oversight. This means that as the negotiations go forward, whatever this committee decides in this regard will need to be the official position of the European Parliament, which will then discuss and finally have to reach an agreement with the Council. What is currently on the table when it comes to explainability? Because again, there are so many other points that I would like to focus on today, but in view of time and being precise when it comes to my answers, when it comes to explainability, there are two things that are currently being discussed. The first is that AI systems developed, deployed, and used in the European Union, and these concepts are also important because, as I've hinted previously, they also relate to how we define the actors, the different actors in the supply chain of AI systems, especially when it comes to liability, responsibility, and accountability. But explainability means, in the eyes of the European Parliament, that these systems need to be explainable. But then this leads us to another question, which is what happens to those systems that cannot be explained? Because you, much better than I can, understand the so-called black box phenomenon and the possible technical constraints that exist when it comes to ensuring explainability. And there the question is, should they be allowed in the first place? If so, under what circumstances? And as you might be aware as well, the Commission's approach to legislating or regulating AI systems is a risk-based one, which means that systems that are considered as high risk, and you can very well imagine some of the sectors where those systems operate that would be considered as high risk, will have to comply with a set of very strict specific requirements, many of them with a technical dimension, of course. But linked to this explainability, there's something else that we've been working, especially from the perspective of the S&D Group, which is the right to an explanation. And perhaps from your points of view, this is not so pressing for today's discussion, but understanding the impact that AI can have on society and on ourselves, not just as average consumers, because again, AI is not your typical run-of-the-mill product, but also as citizens. Think about surveillance systems. What happens when we are, or our rights are adversely affected by these technologies? What kind of power, what kind of possibility for judicial or other kind of redress do we have? And this is where the right to an explanation is very important. However, as much as this right, from my personal perspective, should be guaranteed, and when you speak with industry, of course, it becomes very important to understand how this could be achieved. And this is why there needs to be a balance, or a balance needs to be stricken as to how to make sure that even for those systems that are not possible to explain, if these systems are allowed to be commercialized in the first place, then the explanation that the consumer or the citizen should be given is the system cannot be explained because from this step onwards, we cannot understand what goes in or how the system deals with it. Beyond the input data, we cannot explain it further. And then it will be up to the court, if ever a consumer or a citizen brings an action before court, to decide how to take that point into consideration. This on explainability. But before I turn to the second question, perhaps I can also tell you a little bit about what we're doing when it comes to transparency and human oversight. When it comes to transparency, I think the baseline is to make sure that the user, meaning the person, the individual that will have to operate the AI system on behalf of a company or another kind of legal entity, is able and understands enough about that system to do so. In this context, there's something else that we've been working in the Parliament, again, also a bit pioneered by the S&D Group, which is the concept of AI literacy. Because at the moment, we feel that AI literacy has two ways in which it is very important. First of all, for any employee that is operating an AI system on behalf of a company, but there, of course, you would expect the degree of knowledge to be slightly different from that of the average citizen, but also AI literacy when it comes to all of us, or maybe actually beyond this room, that have no understanding of what AI is, how it can impact us, and how we can seek protection from it. That is on transparency. Then when it comes to human oversight, I think the baseline, once again, because as you can imagine, this is a political process of negotiation, so there are different views, and I cannot yet tell you about the final result, which will be in the legislation. But the baseline is, and that I can already tell you with some certainty, that at the very least, there needs to be a button that can be pushed. And again, looking at a room full mostly of engineers, I don't know how you feel about it, but as far as we've been able to exchange with industry, this is something that not only is feasible, but should and has to be feasible. And this perhaps is a nice segue into the second question, which is having in mind the relevance of AI for social good, what kind of ethics would you propose for AI? Well, there, I think I can talk a little bit about a piece of literature that I find very important when talking about AI, and that is Kate Crawford's book, Atlas of AI. And she has two concepts that I find very important here. The first is the technological inevitability. Just because something is technologically possible doesn't mean that we need to pursue it. And oftentimes, instead of asking, where can we use this technology? Where can we use this AI system? The question should be we be using it? Do we need to be using it? And so on. And this also means that so far we've seen AI being used to, let's say, support, the capitalistic system and military and defense and so on. But in the same vein as we invest in AI systems that support these areas, I think it's very important that we start driving the conversation towards how AI systems can also benefit education, health, and so on. That conversation has started. I think today we have some very obvious cases. But ultimately, when it comes to AI, responsibility, and all the principles that we are currently trying to translate into legislation, and this is a very difficult endeavor, because an ethical principle is not the same as a legal principle. And how do you codify into law, into a specific technical requirement that people like yourselves in the future will have to comply with in order for your companies to be able to legally sell a product in the internal market of the European Union? How do you do that? That is very difficult, but many of the buzzwords that we've heard today are those that we are focusing on. In terms of having a guiding set of principles that should be observed by all AI operators in the EU, much like what you have in Article 5 of the General Data Protection Regulation. And those values, those principles are those of transparency, fairness, accountability, reliability, security, and so on. Some of them will be concretely translated into technical requirements in the regulation itself. Others, what we are trying to work on is how they could, for instance, be translated into codes of conduct, voluntary codes of conduct for industry, or also translated by European standard organizations when they are producing outcome-based technical standards, and also for the European Union's future role, for the European Commission's, apologies, future role in providing common specifications also for industry. I've had a very interesting meeting this week in Microsoft's headquarters in Brussels, where they were telling me about their latest take on ethical AI. I think Pedro Soleiro has already mentioned it in his presentation. That is a very good example of how voluntary action can be meaningful and can provide an example, to other smaller players. At the same time, I am not a big believer in self-regulation, and I also think that, especially because of the impact that AI has, it is important that we have some safeguards in place, even though we need to keep in mind the need to not stifle innovation in the EU, and ultimately allow that any research and development in this area also contributes to social good, and that we try as much as we can to steer the discussion, investment, and development into that area. I don't know, because I recall what Anna mentioned as her dream. It goes a bit into this notion that I was talking about from Kate Crawford's book about just because it's possible, should we be doing it? With health data, that is, of course, a very particular discussion, because on the one hand, health is one of the main concerns of populations worldwide. There was a while ago Europe Day, and in the European Parliament they did a day with activities, all kinds of stuff. And one of the activities was you had a number of cups like this pertaining to different topics, digital transition, health and environment, employment, jobs, and so on. And each person that visited the parliament that day should pick up a little ball and put it in the cup pertaining to the matter that was of most concern to them. It won't be surprising to you if I tell you that the one that was filled by far with the highest number of balls was that concerning health. And so I think there's a lot of untapped potential. There's also now the proposal for the European health data space. But at the same time, I think that is a very good example of an area where a lot of social good can be done. And there's a lot of potential, but we need to make sure that the right safeguards are in place. And perhaps to finish, because as I said, there's so much that one can talk about in this context that I also don't want to make you take away nothing by telling you too much. But sandboxes are a good example that we are also discussing currently in the context of the AI Act, because sandboxes are very important, and perhaps some of you might disagree, but they are not a blank check to all of a sudden suspend certain fundamental rights. And that is how I will conclude, by saying that the difficulty with legislating AI in comparison with any other kinds of products that we might have in the internal market of the European Union is that, again, it's not your run-of-the-mill product, and it is a product that can have massive impacts on fundamental rights. And currently the difficulty is that, first of all, we don't have market surveillance authorities that are equipped to make this sort of assessment, such as an impact on fundamental rights for certain products, which is why it's so important to see companies like Microsoft putting forward examples of how to do it on a voluntary basis. And second of all, when it comes to the protection of fundamental rights and also the development of policies around AI, I think there's still a very noticeable shortness of staff and experts that would be needed in order for the governance structure that is being discussed in the context of the AI Act to be put into place, a little bit like what is happening also, unfortunately, with the GDPR. I hope I've given you some food for thought, but again, this will be an exchange as I understand it, so I will stop here and pass on to Inês.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation as well. So I, as Professor Eugénio kindly introduced, I come from Fraunhofer, Portugal, from the research group of Assistive Information and Communication Solutions, where I had the Intelligent Systems group. Just for you to understand a little bit, we are 3 groups in this research institute. So together with the Intelligent Systems, we have the Human-Centered Design group, and this group is concerned with how people interact with technology, finding the best requirements and the best use cases for technology, and also to evaluate the use of technology by humans, by people. So we usually say this group is a people group. The other group is Connected Things, and in this group, so all the tools and software, hardware that make possible for technology to work in real settings is being researched and developed. And Intelligent Systems is in the middle, so is the intelligence part, and we develop the algorithms and the intelligence behind the technology. In 5 years ago, when we defined our research strategy for the next 5 years, one of our innovation areas that we decided to include was accountable AI already at the time. Because we felt that in order to create these successful solutions, technological solutions with the algorithms and the intelligence behind, to be successful in the practice, in the real world, we needed to think about accountability, about responsibility, and how this could make a positive contribution to the world. So one of the flagship projects we have been having regarding this topic, and I will approach the topic of explainability with this example. So it's called Transparent Artificial Medical Intelligence. It's an international partnership we are developing together with Inês and the CMU University from the United States. And our role in this project is to try to develop not only explainable methods for working in the field of medical imaging, but also to understand what is the most adequate explanation to different kinds of users. So if we think about a medical imaging system and a decision support system, for example, that will say if a certain image of the body has a certain disease or not, this can who will be the person that will look at this decision? In the first place, of course, the medical doctor, or maybe a surgeon, or maybe other actors, or maybe even the patient. So the explanations need to be targeted to the end user, and we need to find also the best way to communicate this information. But in the course of this project and this year, we have been so also looking at some questions that arise from this problem. And well, unfortunately, no one likes black boxes, but the fact is that currently we still need to choose between a black box that has higher performance and a more understandable algorithm that has lower performance. So this raises the question of what is best in the end. I don't know if any of you had in the position of having to review the decision of an algorithm, of an AI algorithm. I can ask the audience. No, and I think not many people had, because, and I think we know very little about how humans react to a suggestion, even if it's explained or not, of an automatic system. And I think that the basis of human oversight and the usefulness of explainable AI also depends a lot on this. And on one side, of course, there is the AI literacy. Of course, people who are operating an AI system and reviewing the decisions of an AI system need to have a basic knowledge about the functioning of AI. And this is very important. And at Fraunhofer, we have been working also in preparing contents that are bringing a little bit of knowledge about AI to the more common audiences, to people working in other fields, in within technological fields, but not experts in AI. But there's a lot of work to do. And on the other hand, I think we need to study how people react to a decision or a suggestion given by an automatic system, whether it is explained or not. Because we can also, and we have been collaborating also with a group from Milan, who is, and this group they are really studying this issue. And I can give you an example. So they had a system that was automatically labeling electrocardiograms, so the exams we do to the heart, to find anomalies. And they provided the decision and an explanation. And on purpose, they provided wrong decisions and wrong explanations. So all the combinations, right decisions with wrong explanations, right decisions with right explanations, right decisions with wrong explanations, and so on. All the combinations possible. And they provided this to more expert and more novice medical doctors, and they evaluated the final accuracy of the final decision. So the doctors could change. The algorithm was only giving a suggestion with an explanation, and the doctor could make a final decision that is different. And they noticed that the best accuracy was given by the best performing algorithm, even without explanations. In the end, they found that providing an explanation was more confusing to the medical doctors than providing only the decision. So this is also food for thought. I think it's an example, of course, but I think that we should also not forget that to consider how the human will react to the technology, to the explanation that is provided, if this explanation is adequate to this user or not, if he has the ability to understand it and to act on it, or if they are either over-relying on technology or either over-suspicious of technology, and how this can also influence the final results. And I think that most of all, we need to be sure and have tools to be able to audit these systems, to make sure they are working correctly and over time, because we know that the decisions of AI systems are not deterministic. It's different from from the previously usual software that is explicitly programmed. So we know that there is an error associated, and I believe that also one of the things that is very important to make sure we are contributing positively to have good solutions based on AI is to make sure that the systems remain accurate. And to conclude, I would just say that regarding ethics, we have at Fraunhofer been having some discussions with philosophers, and this is an issue we have in mind. Of course, from a technical perspective, we have a very practical approach to ethics, of course. We try to incorporate these principles and translate them to tools and technologies and metrics that can be useful in practice. To finalize, we are now part of a big initiative in Portugal, which I believe will for sure make a positive impact in this field and help advancing this field, which is the Next Gen AI, a Center for Responsible AI. It's part of the program for recovery and resilience. and will bring together at a scale without precedent in Portugal and also internationally, companies, startups, research institutes. FEUP is also involved, of course, with Professor Carlos. And we will be working in these topics in privacy preserving machine learning, which we didn't approach here, but is also very important to ensure the privacy of data throughout the whole process of developing and deploying machine learning based algorithms. And in these topics of evaluating and giving the right information about the systems that are deployed, and also evaluating the uncertainty of decisions and the accuracy in use. So to finalize, I believe that successful solutions that are based on AI mean responsible solutions. And we can also ask who is responsible, if it's the system or is the creator or the operator, or there are many players involved. But I believe that is basically beneficial AI solutions. Successful must mean beneficial. And I believe that beneficial comes from an interplay of good data, good models, and good use, and we should not forget the good use.
Thank you.
Let's now listen to Peter.
Okay, thanks a lot. Okay, thank you. Well, muito obrigado. Well, that's how far my Portuguese goes. No, I don't. No, but thanks a lot for inviting me to this panel, and already kind of wonderful perspectives here on the topic. I think a question like, do we want to have explainable AI? I think everyone would go like, yeah, of course we want explainable AI. Yeah, but it's a complex topic. I think here you already see that in the panel. You gave the example where decision without explanation worked better than vice versa. Similar example, I organized a data mining competition, machine learning competition in 2000, so 22 years ago. I'm getting old, short reminder, but and we had two tasks there. It was like we had a data set, who wants to buy a particular product, and trying to predict that, but also provide a particular explanation. And lo and behold, there was someone who won kind of the how well can I predict type competition, and another group basically won the competition how can I best explain. Yeah, but the how can I best explain group scored, well, let's say it was not above the middle part of the competition, right? So you can have a great explanation, but if it's a rubbish prediction, what is the trade-off? So I'm not saying one or the other here, but I think that just illustrates that these are difficult or interesting topics. Also, I had a student this week, and he wants to do kind of his thesis research on explainable AI. He first looked into the standard approaches. How can you explain a prediction with Lime-Shep, and what are the most important factors, etc., etc. But then he came back to me. He says, like, well, he said a couple of things like, it's great that we have so-called black box and white box models, but these white box models, no mortal will actually understand, even if it's a simple decision tree, what that exactly means. Yeah, and what is a single explanation? Should it not be a dialogue? If I try to explain something to someone else, we enter into a dialogue as opposed to a one-off explanation. Yeah, so difficult topics. I have the honorary position of being the last one in the panel, and also be closer to the cocktail. So I'm going to take a somewhat philosophical tack here at the topic. So I think it's important that we broaden a little bit our views on, in this context, what is ethics really? Yeah, and also how could it translate into regulation? And maybe we should even broaden our view of what is AI, or what is the research exercise of AI, and what is it, what makes us human? So you can see I'm turning philosophical now, right? So, and I'll try to fit that into some short statements. But you can see AI is growing up. We're using it on a daily basis. I work for this company called Pega, and now we apply it in different markets, but just in the marketing market alone, we cover around 2 billion consumers. Yeah, so that's hundreds of millions of decisions, automated decisions that are being taken daily, right? So it's, in that sense, AI is not something of the future. It's already happening today at a very, very large scale. I think that's important also for regulation. And I like it. You explained also how you want to get close to what is actually happening right now, because I think that's really important. Feed's-eye, that was another example of that large-scale application. Yeah, so basically, in that sense, AI is growing up. It's moving away from techno-optimism in AI childhood, and we're moving into AI puberty. And what do you need to do with teenagers? You need to give them some rules. Yeah, so the question is, do we need to give AI some rules here? Yeah, and I think a very common way to think about ethics is in terms of rules, constraints, and restrictions. But to talk about the broader picture of ethics, ethics is not just about what not to do. Ethics is about how to live a good life. Yeah, it's about how to do the right thing. I think that's a broader view of what ethics is really about. So in that sense, that balance between ethical constraints or catching the AI opportunity, that's a false contradiction. I think, yeah. That means also that ethics has a broader reach than just regulations, because there's lots of stuff which is, even with the new EU AI Act, which is allowed, but which is not a form of empathic doing good type AI. Yeah, and you need to be able, in these kind of large AI systems that are taking hundreds of millions of decisions daily, you need to be able to operationalize that. Yeah, so to give you an example, let's take one of our customers, a bank in Australia, and they have somewhat 8 million customers, but they're making something like in the order of 25 to 30 million real-time recommendations to their customers every single day. Yeah, so, and then the question is, yeah, what are relevant recommendations? Yeah, so these kind of these things as privacy, etc., is just assume that that's already all kind of tackled. Still, I can make selfish recommendations that only benefit the bank, versus I can make empathic recommendations that nudge, that help the customer. Some things that they do is they nudge customers towards, how can I get more government benefits? You would think, why would the bank do that, right? It's not about their products, but it is about making sure that their customers lead a financial securing and enhancing the financial well-being of their customers, right? So that's at least they're trying to put thinking into how can we, even beyond all the, let's say, the constraints or the regulatory quote constraints of transparency, explainability, fairness, you name it. How can we even within that make sure that we are doing the right thing? Yeah, so don't think of ethics just in terms of constraints and that ethics tells us what not to do and give you a slap on the wrist. No, it's about how to lead a good life. And you can actually operationalize that into those AI systems that decide on how do we rank on what's the best recommendation, for example. Do we use profit for the bank, or do we use this is what the customer really would like to hear, what would really help the customer? I think for regulation, that also means that today already in Pedro's presentation, Anna's presentation, and here as well, and we've been talking about these 6 pillars, etc. And I think those are great kind of, they're not constraints, but they're almost like great principles, transparency, fairness, etc. But what I'm missing there a little bit, and I'm not a lawmaker, so I don't have any idea how to operationalize that, but how can we build in, don't do to others what you don't want to have done to yourself, right? So, and you were talking about what's a beneficial AI system, or what's a beneficial, that could be an entire system, or it could be one micro level decision in millions, in a sea of millions decisions that are being made. But how can we actually ensure that these decisions are beneficial. And that's something, it's still a little bit lacking in that regulation, also because I think it's hard probably to operationalize, but it's super important to see if we can work that in. Because I can make a system that's fair, transparent, explainable, all of those things, and it's the biggest sociopath on earth because the system is just doing what's good for the system and not what's good for the citizen or the customer. I think that broader look on regulation, I would favor that as well. And the final broader look, I think, is when we talk about, we need to have a broader look at AI. I think there's lots of these discussions. Google has a nice large language model, and you can chat with it. And Google engineer asked, "Are you conscious?" Of course, Lambda says, "Yes, I'm a conscious system." Right? So someone else tweeted on Twitter and said, "Well, let me ask the same question a similar question to GPT-3. Are you a squirrel?" Yeah. So this little beast, and of course GPT-3 said, "Yeah, I'm a squirrel. So what does it feel like to be a squirrel?" Yeah. So I don't think that we're nowhere near artificial general intelligence yet. But even if we were, I think it's way too narrow to think about us humans as just intelligent creatures. Yeah, we are creative creatures, we're emotional creatures, we're loving creatures, we're so much more than just intelligence. And in that sense, I think it's also interesting to study that through the artificial lens. Yeah, so not just study artificial intelligence, but also study artificial acts. So artificial creativity, emotions, etc. And I think it's and then also important to look through those things through the ethical lens. Because ultimately, it was already said earlier today, AI is not some technology that's done to us. It's a technology that's built by humans, designed through humans, with all the pluses and minuses. So it's not that we don't have any control. Will there be screw-ups in future? Yes, of course. There will be some great cases of using AI, and sometimes things will go wrong. The key thing is not like, will things go wrong? The key thing is, do we have the agency to do something about it? And I'm a firm believer that we have that, that we will have that agency, provided that we have the proper kind of laws and regulations in place, because I think that would be great. That gives us a level playing field for the cool kids that want to play nice, right? So in that sense, I would definitely welcome them. But in that sense, I would say the future of AI is human, and we should be in control. And I think we are in control of the technology. Not always, but we can fix things.
Thank you, Peter. So we have now, I would say, 15 to 20 minutes, or 15 minutes for a few questions. You may address to particular members of the panel if you wish. So, please.
Okay. Hello? Hello? Okay, got it. So maybe this. I'm gonna go back to this issue of explainability, and let me do the analogy. When I buy a product in Europe, I really don't know, and I couldn't care less how it works. My washing machine. I mean, why should I really care? What I do care is that there's some certification from the EU saying that, yes, this is a good product, and it works according to some specification. So maybe this focus too much on explainability is really the wrong focus. Well, not that it's not a laudable goal, it's good to have explainability, but maybe this is going down a rat hole because most people cannot really explain their algorithms, okay? So there's basically a dead end to some extent there. So maybe what we should be looking at is how can we certify products based on AI, and who assumes the liability for that? So mostly this is a question for the ladies in the panel, but of course, Peter, you're welcome to jump in if you'd like. So. It's a very American perspective.
Yeah, I understand that.
Thank you, nevertheless, for the question. Perhaps I could rewind in order to answer it properly. Before the Commission's proposal, the Parliament did something that it has the right to do, and that is to make a proposal of its own and tell the Commission, now you go and legislate on the basis of this example that we are giving you. And I was heavily involved in that exercise, which was, I think, a once-in-a-lifetime experience. And indeed, in that legislative report of the Parliament, we proposed something along the lines of what you are calling for, and that is a sort of European certification of trustworthiness or ethical AI, if you will. Somehow that didn't make it into the Commission's proposal, mostly because I would argue, again, based on my experience as a jurist, that the Commission heavily relied on existing product legislation, product safety legislation, existing frameworks, and so there's not so much a certification as such. There are other mechanisms, and there is this concept that the Commission keeps talking about, which is trustworthiness, that now, through the work we're doing, we are trying to translate into concrete requirements that a company can comply with, and then say, we are trustworthy European AI. So it's a work in progress, but a very pertinent point. Then on the second question, which we already exchanged a little bit on during the coffee break, which is the question of responsibility. So again, the Legal Affairs Committee is the one dealing with civil law, civil responsibility, liability. And there, what we are currently in the process of discussing and mostly settling on is, first of all, who are the relevant actors in the supply chain and what kind of responsibilities each of them have, also in relation to what requirements, specifically also ethics. I think ultimately you will see that most of the requirements, the specific requirements in the AI Act will fall or will be shared and duly specified where they are shared, where they are exclusive between two actors. The first entity are the so-called deployers. So the entities that develop the AI system are responsible for all kinds of development choices and commercialize the product, will put the product in the market. And then the second actor will be the so-called, and here you see how the legislation, how the sausage factory works, because the Commission calls them the providers. We in the Parliament are currently wanting to propose the term provider, but essentially they mean the same. And that is the entity that is then putting the AI system into service. And who will then have a number of concrete employees deploying the system, the so-called users, which are also important in this chain of responsibility, because as we concluded, these will, for the most part, carry no responsibility insofar as they have no power over what kind of decisions go into the development and the deployment of the AI system. I hope I have addressed everything, but I think that's the beauty of having a panel.
Yeah, so like in the spirit of a panel, let me try to vehemently disagree with you in some shape or form. Yeah, okay, like I'll keep it short because I'm also thirsty. Yeah, so I understand, like you say, well, I take an aspirin, you know, I don't complain, I don't know how aspirin works, or I step into a plane. And I, to some degree, I agree with you, but here's a couple of ways how this metaphor falls short. Because let's say you have a system that decides whether you can get a mortgage or not. You can say, oh, that's a single plane, but it's actually not a single plane. It's actually millions of planes because, you know, like you'll all get different kind of decisions on whether you get that mortgage or not. And that's specifically how you kind of flow through that AI. Yeah, so in a way, it's not a single plane. There's many different planes that are all different. And then also this AI is changing on an ongoing basis. Yeah, so the bank may revise their credit risk model for loan acceptance once a quarter. But these kind of other models around marketing or whatever, they'll have thousands of models and they're constantly being updated. Maybe that loop is even closed and you have online learning. So this entire AI is constantly learning. Yeah, so it's in a way I like it when we say, why don't we treat AI just like the rest? But here are some differences how AI, you can't really say it's one car or it's one type of plane or one type of car because it's many different cars at the same time that constantly change.
Yeah, no, but the program, what the EU should say is that it cannot discriminate, so it cannot be biased, it cannot do
things, right? But of course, everybody, the customer is different. So.
Well, the program is you can have the same program, but the program is the whatever. Huh? There's all these human choices that Pedro was talking about. So that will result in all kinds of different models. Plus, then the impact on the different applicants here in the room will be quite different. Yeah. So it doesn't mean that there's nothing you can do about it, but I think it's more complex than just saying, oh, I have a plane, now I know it's good. And so I think I also don't, and generally I think it's good. What I really like is that, for instance, in the EU Act, it's very much about looking at a particular AI system, because generic technology, technology is not good nor bad, nor is it neutral, right? So it's what you do with that very specific technology that will result into something.
Just complement that. Sorry, in a few words. One thing is a washing machine, and another thing is a very complex machine that is able to autonomously do decision making. And sometimes it's even very difficult to certify a system that is not able to, is like a black box. And in order to certify this, you need to understand how does it work. And sometimes explainability or explicability is much relevant for certification.
So that's another question.
No. Researchers and deployers, etc.
I would just like to clarify that, of course, my comment regarding explainability is not that is not needed. I think it depends a lot on the application and the field. And I think that in latest years, the enormous progress was also made in this area, and we have more better ability, a little bit better ability to explain some of the yes, but what I sometimes feel is that we talk so much about explainability that we forget performance and accuracy. And it's called also the white box paradox, because it's the system is wrong, but is so good at argumenting or explaining that it convinces you that he is right. It is right. So it's just that calling for not falling also in the other extreme.
Just a clarification, because I don't think I made that point earlier. When we talk about explainable AI in the context of the AI Act, we are talking about already only high-risk AI systems. So for those AI systems that will be categorized as high risk, that is where we are setting some requirements that are a bit more stringent. So not all AI.
I would like to put a complementary question to the one that was posed here, that is the following. We are talking about the AI. If the AI was an entity and we have to certify the AI, but let's think about explosives, okay? If you like to work with explosives or with guns, you're not going to certify, or actually you can certify the explosive. It needs to follow a certain procedure. It needs to be conserved and maintained under certain rules. But you want to have the certification of the person who's going to use the explosives. And so, and where and when can it use? And so my question is, what kind of, let's say, concerns there are? Where can we use AI and where we can't use it or we shouldn't use it? So an extreme example, during First World War, we used chemical weapons everywhere. Nowadays, they are banned, not because they are not available, but because the suffering they are causing is beyond our values. So what kind of values do we have for AI?
Nobody wants to take that.
Yeah, so you're saying, well, it's not just about technology, but how we use it and what we use it for, right? Yeah, and who. And who. Yeah, so I fully agree with the first part of the statement. I think people talk a lot about technology in general, and it's moved, even face recognition, because you can think of tons of really good applications So it's what do you use it for? Which thing is important to decide this is not face recognition related to emotion expression in the context of muscle. We don't want it. So I think the purpose of the system, that's incredibly important. I think that was also a step up from the earlier thinking, which was much more about these principles like bias, explainability, accuracy, etc., which are very important. Key thing is, I think, it's like, what is the purpose? What are you building the system for? And how do you use it? So you can put governance around it as well. You know, like how it's being used. So I'm afraid I agree with you, so I should not have answered your.
Maybe just to add that that is, again, a very interesting question because it relates very much to the political discussion and legislative discussion that takes place at the moment. Again, AI and this idea of inevitability of technology, AI is a creation of the human genius. So we have all the power, at least when it comes to not only how we use it, but also if we use it at all. And currently what you see is that there's some discussion and difference in views in terms of what kind of uses should be banned. A very concrete one is not just facial emotion recognition, but facial recognition altogether. You have some, I would say a majority might even be forming within the European Parliament, which is one of the two heads that decide on a ban for facial recognition technology. It's a very hot topic at the moment, I think understandably. But so that is certainly something, a reflection that is taking place. What kind of uses should be banned, or what kind of uses are so complicated that they should really be completely regulated to almost the point of suffocation. And maybe if I can, while I'm here, because earlier there was a very pertinent point about how ethics is not just about what you cannot do, but also about what you should do. And there, we've also been working on another principle that is next to all of those we've already mentioned, and that is the principle two, in fact. One is social responsibility and environmental sustainability. The problem is that once you start working on that and how to translate that into regulation, for instance, in my case, I had a number of lobbyists knocking at my door saying, oh no, because how do you translate that into technical requirements? Well, then actually further along the way, I spoke with the commission. They said, no, we are actually already working on some common specifications where we are producing this, translating this idea into outcome-based criteria. And my point is that for me, that is still a little bit up in the air, but I would be very interested to hear how for you can see such a notion being translated into concrete requirements. But I do think it's possible. I've heard from those that know better than myself that it is possible, and we are working on it, but not without hurdles. And those that were knocking on my door are knocking on other doors, and let's see which majority wins.
Rule out certain things based on hard rules you don't know if you want to do it, right? You don't have a hard rule, but then it's like, how do you prioritize? Yeah? So for the nerds and geeks in the room, what is your objective function? Yeah? So what are we maximizing here? And there you can make choices around that. In a narrow case, like in a marketing case, you can choose between I'm recommending something that the customer is interested in, or it increases the value of the company to the customer, versus I'm going to weigh what is the profit that we make on this particular product. So there you have it. You know, that's an example where it can be kind of where these objectives can actually be. It's in a narrower use case, but it's an example where actually these objectives and purposes are being kind of operationalized down to the level of individual kind of real-time decision.
I am afraid. And I am afraid because I'm afraid of an over-regulated world that impedes creativity. And as a data scientist, I believe in the power of data. I believe in multiplying 900 columns and 900 solutions and 900 rows. even if people tell me that it would be much nicer to explain it with 3x3 matrix. And I've heard this as a real feedback, because humans like what they can fit into their minds and their Excel spreadsheets. And so if we make things, for many applications, I don't care about explainability. I want my car not to crash, period. I want the best possible model that's gonna get me there alive. I want the best possible cancer screening algorithm, and I don't need to understand it. I just need to measure what it does and whether it does it in a fair way across the different types of people that need to be subject to that algorithm, to that model. And I think because as legislators, I understand that we need to account for the worst possible scenario, and people do feel the fear of what if they discover that I put my trash out at 8 p.m. and not 9, or whatever I put in my trash. But this, in a big data world, nobody cares. Nobody cares about you, me, or anybody else. It's just what the movement of the masses make when the masses walk in a direction versus others, and how fear and love affect human behavior. So by not allowing de-identified data to be mashed but tracked, like if I do a medical exam here in the private system, the public system doesn't do. I don't have a health ID card that represents everything I've been through in my life, so I get judged according to the subset of my own data. But if my own data and everybody else's data, de-identified, were available, not just the pharmaceuticals would be able to make sense of that data. We, as researchers, would be able to put our big data algorithms on there and identify correlations that aren't obvious to a doctor who has to train according to what fits his brain. Brilliant though that brain can be, it cannot do correlations like a hypercomputer can. So yes, my dream is that we manage to get to a space where we can share de-identified information, and it's not an obstacle to dreams, and not regulated by fear or small-mindedness. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. It's time for the last question or comment.
Yes, hello. So I would like to pose a question. So I think the discussion so far has been that explainability is kind of a speed bump or a hurdle to development, but I would like to pose it as, is there like a hard limit to what we can accomplish with explainability, and what would change the EU's position on explainability? Like, would, for example, other non-regulated countries jumping ahead on AI research change their policy, or yeah?
No problem. I'll try to answer succinctly, also addressing a little bit what Anna's points just now. When it comes to third country players, such as the US most notably, but also China, although I think their set of values is really very different from ours. What you will see is that currently they are paying a lot of attention to what we're doing here. And unlike with data protection, they think that our first mover advantage, which essentially means those who regulate first have the so-called Brussels effect, might not work in the EU's favor. Nevertheless, this whole notion of trustworthiness and explainability is one element of trustworthiness or ethical AI, is that ultimately that will be a competitive advantage of EU products, because they will make them more trustworthy towards consumers wherever they may be. Then on the hard lines and explainability, I think, as I said, especially with AI and regulating AI, the point is balance, and really to put some important safeguards in place without stifling innovation. And I think you will find other people that are also like me at the negotiation table, who are perhaps even more in line with how you see things, which is why, again, we hope that is the balance that comes of it. But especially for certain kinds of uses, I do think explainability must be required, because if my sister doesn't get a certain job because the algorithm underlying the recruiter's system somehow jeopardizes her, and she needs to be able to get some redress from that decision, I want her to be able to receive an explanation. Also, when it comes to health data, I think there's a flip side to what you said, and that is the underrepresentation, because that was also a point in your presentation, and the representation, I think it was, of Asian demographics, but of women in health. And there's a brilliant book, which is Women in AI, by Carolina Criado Perez, you might have heard of it, where she talks brilliantly about how currently women suffer from a lot of diseases, or actually don't get proper health care, because for years the male by default research was in place also when it comes to health data. So again, and to conclude, it's about balance also when it comes to explainability, but in some cases, especially where our rights, our most important rights are at stake, or our health and safety, because these are the values you will see in the legislation, yes, that should, in my personal opinion, be a hard line. Whether others will follow suit, that is why striking the right balance is so important, because if we do it right, even if the US are currently, looking at us a little like, I think they will follow. Hopefully, they will follow.
Professor Eugénio, can I ask one question? One of my concerns is that explanation is a very comfortable word, right? So we say explanation and we feel comfortable about it. In the end, explanation is going to be a technology, right? And we all know about technologies. And technologies are, in psychology, it's also... Yes, it's a psychological, but it's going to be a technology, right? With psychological effects, but it's going to be a technology. So technologies fail, have limitations, can be used for the wrong purposes. So I imagine that immediately once you set up a set of standard technologies for explanation, there will be hundreds of people, thousands of people working on technologies to misuse explanation, or ways of misusing explanations. And I always think about this expression that is very common, which is lies, damn lies, and statistics. And we all know how statistics can be used to trick people. And I'm kind of guessing that soon we'll be saying lies, damn lies, statistics, and then explanations. Okay. I don't know if you have any comment on that?
One sentence, that is something that I've heard this week from a colleague, the danger also in requiring explanation, and that's why we're limiting it or trying to a set of things that, if they make it to the final legislative text, again, would provide some balance, but very pertinent point. That is the only thing I can say.
Yes,
But we feel very comfortable about the word explanation. That's the problem.
yes, and I would add human oversight as well to the comfortable words. Despite human oversight is not a technology, but I think it can also be a concept that is like a tick in the checkbox. Like, oh, we have human. You have human in the loop. We have Trump in the loop. We have. It's like ticking the checkbox, and it's done, and it can bring real danger. I would like to conclude referring to the health applications, which is I'm a biomedical engineer, so it's my field of application from the heart, and I would say that I think we should really advance, and the health area has a lot to gain with the big data analysis, with AI applications, and we should for sure push the limits of technology in this field, and we should be able to do so. And for sure, FDA is a bit further ahead in certifying AI-based medical products. In the EU, there's still we are still finding the right standard, or the right corporate bodies that should notified bodies that should that should certify such products. And I think this is a really urgent issue as well as the data lakes. We need to make health data available across Europe. We should take advantage of our diversity, of being so many countries together, and have these data lakes in place yesterday. So this is, but I think that there are many initiatives in the technological steps that are needed to achieve this. And I believe that in next years we'll be having different discussions.
Yeah, maybe as a final word, I think earlier on you were also talking about awareness. And I was talking a little bit also about, if AI makes decisions, make sure that all the stakeholders or all the purposes are reflected, etc. And that AI is not a technology that's done to us. It's a human technology that we actually have control over. You also said that it's from a legislation point of view, but even within what are legally allowed use cases, what is proper or good use of AI, we can have control over that. And I think for the data scientists here in the room, you're kind of comfortable with that idea. You know that data science is not evil black magic. It's also not evil good magic. Sometimes things go wrong, but it is something that it's something we can do something about it. We have agency. Yeah, so that's maybe why we're somewhat more comfortable around the technology. But I think that's why it's also so more important that we kind of demystify this AI thing a little bit to all the stakeholders, all the citizens, all the consumers, and that we help, that we at least do our job in terms of explaining what AI is and what it isn't. Yeah, so that everyone can have a say. Yeah, and that everyone can have that some similar level of comfort and agency around. How can we stimulate good use, and how can we prevent best use. Yep.
So, as you see, we have been talking about science and technology, not about religion or something like that. So it's always subject to be criticized, and disagreement, etc. That's science, I believe. So this was a very enlightening discussion, but we have to finish. And once again, thank you to the students, the rest of the audience, the members of the panel, thank you very much, and the organizers, of course, for this remarkable event. Thank you. An applause for